WorldMag.com presents Joel Belz, founder of World Magazine and God's World News children's monthly magazines. When it comes to raising children, parents long for a formula that will produce the perfect son or daughter, says Joel. A few years ago, Joel was asked to contribute a chapter to a book exploring the hard questions of nurturing children with a biblical foundation. This podcast features the first part of that chapter.
Some folks attribute the saying to Casey Stengel and others to Yogi Berra. It probably wasn't original with either one, but in any case, it's wonderful. It says, predictions are always difficult, but especially about the future. And even more especially, we might add, when we're talking about the future of our children. What we all long for, of course, is a formula. Take 3 cups of A, half a teaspoon of B, a dash of C, and stir vigorously for 17 years. Presto! Out comes an absolutely perfect son or daughter. In other words, we want to be able, with a high degree of certainty, to predict the future about our children. And being more inclined toward naturalistic solutions than we are toward supernaturalistic ones, we hurry to formulate our recipes to make sure we are doing everything right at this end, so we can be absolutely sure everything will come out just right on the other end. And when it doesn't, well, we hurry back and reformulate our recipes. 2 generations ago, evangelicals' recipes for their children included equal doses of parental involvement in the local public school PTA and a vigorous youth group at the local church. And we were always careful to remember how important healthy portions of family devotions and bedtime prayers were. A generation ago, that had been either replaced or augmented for many with a recipe flavored heavily by Christian schools. When Christian schools proved not to have a 100% success rate, homeschooling became the new formula. And by the time a new millennium dawned, still another new recipe, which actually was very old, became the new rage. We call them classical schools. How many more such readjustments will it take before we learn that God doesn't deal in formulas? It might prove to be an embarrassing question. His order for passing on His covenant love from one generation to another is at the same time a far simpler and a far more complex matter. It should be no surprise that we tend to look for formulas and recipes. The Bible itself often seems to point us in such a direction. Again and again, God's promises seem, at first, to be rooted in conditions that strike us as very formula-like. Not least of those, of course, is the Bible's most famous formula of all, having to do with child-rearing, found in Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Make this cake according to the instructions we seem to read here, and you can count on its turning out just fine. Granted, we've been disappointed and dismayed along the way. We've seen kids whose upbringing seemed just about perfect, who then strayed from the path. But holding staunchly to the formula, we've rationalized both to ourselves and to others that probably, A, we didn't know as much about that upbringing as we thought we did, or B, the child isn't old enough yet to have inherited God's promise. In any case, we reassure ourselves the formula is intact, even if the child and his or her parents aren't. Even before the book of Proverbs, we have God's promises to the patriarchs that appear to be heavily conditioned on the behavior and faithfulness of the parents. Deuteronomy 11 seems full of such implications when it says, "You shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong, and go in and take possession of the land that you are going over to possess, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey." On the other hand, the exact nature of these formulas sometimes gets a little cloudy. What do we make, for example, of the Apostle Paul's direction in Ephesians when he references Exodus 20 and calls the instruction to honor your father and your mother? He calls it the first commandment with promise. The promise of this 5th commandment, oddly, is to the children, not to their parents. The great point of the biblical record, however, is never to direct us toward heroic people in any generation who have been good at qualifying for God's blessings through their great obedience. The point instead is to remind us that everyone except for Jesus himself has failed dismally at such an assignment. There have been lots and lots of promises and good faith commitments from God, but not a single example of anyone who has kept his or her end of the bargain. This is exactly why we must be so very careful about trying to engage in across-the-table agreements between God and us as if we were business equals. Coming to God about our children is instead a matter of vastly subordinate subjects getting a glimpse of the nature of the largely one-way promises of a supremely faithful Father. My father and mother had 8 children. Mom and Dad were faithful parents, not just from the perspective of those who watched them from some distance, but also in the minds of those who observed them up close, and in the hearts of us kids. If we knew that Mom and Dad weren't perfect, we never made much of such faults or held them against our parents. So, folks aren't surprised now, half a century later, to observe that all 8 of the Belz children still walk with the Lord. The reality is, of course, that walk, for some of us, sometimes is more a crawl, a stumble, or even a stagger. But that is part of the point. I remember poignantly, therefore, that as my father lay dying from cancer in 1978, a friend approached him urgently. "Max," he said, "it's important that you write down whatever it was that you and your wife did right with your children. You've got to pass that on. Maybe it should be a book." "Oh, no," Dad responded. "If I did, it would just have one line. It would say quite simply that God was faithful." That was not just weariness on Dad's part. It was an important insight about the main link between a sovereign God and his children. The problem with formula thinking, when it comes to educating and passing our faith on to our children, is that it is always too much rooted in works righteousness, and not nearly enough in God's mercy and grace. We properly, and very theologically, reject works as the means by which we ourselves are justified and brought into a proper relationship with God. But then, too often, we turn right around and act as if that performance, our performance, is critical to how God will respond to our children. We may not formulate it that way in our minds, but it's precisely how we spell it out with our practical living. Somehow, we actually think we can earn God's favor for our children. Or worse yet, that we can wrestle God into a position where he is in our debt. Tragically, the very means by which we do all this tend to become the false gods against which the true God so sternly warns us. The PTA service and church youth groups, the Christian schools, the home schools, the classical schools, even the family devotions and bedtime prayers, all these and more, good and worthy as they are, become that by which we hope our children might be perfected. But, like all false gods, we will find ourselves betrayed in the end if that is where we put our trust.
Thank you for listening to a Joel Belz podcast presented by WorldMag.com, the online home of World Magazine.